Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Ministry of Agriculture's Invasive Species webinar series. Today, we'll be focusing on Leafy Spurge as the first topic of the 3 different webinars we'll be having. My name is Margaret Parsons, and I'm an agro-environmental specialist with the Ministry of Agriculture based out of Humboldt, and I'll be chairing this webinar today. The speakers we have from the ministry today are Alana Johnson, another agro-environmental specialist, and Trevor Lennox, a range management extension specialist. Our guest speaker is Joanne Kwasnicki, a plant health technical advisor with the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities. Firstly, I'll start with a land acknowledgement. The Ministry of Agriculture respects and has the honor of working on lands within Saskatchewan. I wish to acknowledge Saskatchewan is the traditional and ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Blackfoot, Cree, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Sioux, and home of the Métis people. We respect and honor the treaties that are made on all territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we are committed to move forward in partnership with Indigenous nations. Before we begin the webinar, I have a few housekeeping notes. So the presentation is scheduled to take about 40 minutes, leaving time for questions at the end. And if you have any questions during the presentation, you can type them in the question box in the bottom right-hand side of the control panel, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end. During the presentation, you'll be muted, so there's no feedback that will interfere with the audio. If you have any difficulties with your speakers, there's also a telephone option, which would have been in your registration email. After you exit the webinar today, a brief evaluation will appear, so please take the time to fill that out since it helps us plan events in the future. And a link to the recorded webinar as well as a resource will be sent out to any registered participants, and it will be posted on our website following this presentation. And for any CCAs, CEUs will be offered for this webinar. In order to get the credit, you have to attend the entire live event, and there'll be a QR code we'll post at the end of the presentation for you to collect the credit. So if you missed the code and you attended it live, please email us afterwards and we can work with you to get your credit. So at this time, we can start the webinar. Take it away, Alana.
All right, thank you, Margaret. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of background about Leafy Spurge. So Leafy Spurge is an introduced, long-lived, and aggressive perennial that comes back year after year. It's typically found in rangelands or undisturbed areas where it can be very competitive, decreasing the productivity, biodiversity, and carrying capacity of these areas. Once you've seen Leafy Spurge a few times, it starts to get easier to pick out the plant, but some things to keep in mind with ID are that they're typically smooth plants with narrow leaves. In these photos, the plants are all bright green, but as they mature in late summer or early fall, they can take on more of a yellow, orange, or brown appearance. The stems contain a milky sap or latex, which can be irritating to skin and could also be the toxic compound to livestock, so caution should be used when handling it. Height can vary significantly, but plants can grow up to around 1 meter tall, and they have a distinct flowering feature, which is the structure is these heart-shaped bracts that make up part of the greenish yellow flower. So you can see at the top of the slide there where I've circled those bracts. Understanding leafy spurge reproduction can help when you're planning your control options. So each flowering stem can produce over 100 seeds per year, and the seeds stay viable in the soil for up to 8 years. The bulk of germination happens significantly earlier than that, but these seed capsules can burst and send the seeds further away from the parent plant, but the plants can also produced as these seeds float down water, stick to shoes, tires, or hooves of livestock. So that's something to consider when working in an area with leafy spurge. The roots can also be very deep and they can produce rhizomes, and these creeping roots can spread out from that parent plant. So when it comes to similar species, there's a lot of yellow flowering plants. Some are native and some are other invasives. But some things to consider is not only the flowering structure, but what the leaves look like. So all of these plants, I'm just going to go through this really quickly, but they have, for instance, goldenrod species have a very distinct plant, but what makes them similar is they can form these dense patches because some of the goldenrod species have rhizomes. Common tansy is another noxious weed we'll have a webinar on, and this one has almost fern-like leaves that look quite different up close. Yellow toad flax can look similar as far as narrow leaves, but it doesn't necessarily have that milky sap, and it has a snapdragon-like flower. Some other species you might want to look up after the webinar include cypress spurge, and then another native species that has been confused with it is woolly gromwell, but it is a quite fuzzy plant. When it comes to prevention, planning ahead is a great first step in avoiding the weeds and the long-term costs associated with management. Good prevention measures include biosecurity, but they don't have to be extremely difficult or complicated. Learning to ID the plant is one of the first steps. So selecting good weed-free seed is a great prevention option. It's also important to consider where your forages like hay are coming from. And if it's possible to avoid bringing in forages from other areas that you know have weeds, that's great. In the case that that's not possible, choosing to store that feed in areas that can be monitored regularly and sites that have the best available control options is always best. Maintaining healthy fields and pastures that allow for competition against weeds and reduce that soil disturbance and bare ground is important. And then planning ahead by using clean equipment is very helpful. If your equipment can't be cleaned between every site, or if your animals can't be quarantined after being at a site with leafy spurge, it can be helpful to go to those sites last as part of your rotation to avoid unintentional spread to other areas. Good record keeping can also be an important option in combination with the other monitoring efforts. So monitoring doesn't just involve prevention of new populations, it can also involve preventing expansion of existing populations. And that can involve seeing if your control options are working over time. So monitoring is helpful for early detection and rapid response, which involves the identification, rapid control or eradication of the plant. And then this can also be done through things like monitoring can be done in more formal settings like range health assessments, but also formal surveillance or scouting protocols and measures, or it can include regular management activities like when you're out checking your livestock or watering or water sources, you can take a look for these plants. Some helpful tips for monitoring include using the resources that are available. So most of us have phones in our back pockets, and those phones can be used for good quality photos. Maps or apps are great tools to allow you to mark the location of those invasive plants, as well as using apps like Map Invasives that are databases where you can mark occurrences that can be entered either online or on your phone. Other tools can be valuable when you're looking at existing patches, such as using permanent markers or say a fence post at the edge of a population to be able to visualize changes in that patch and how things are working. Some things to think about or keep track of with your record keeping include environmental conditions, and if these plants have been treated with other control options in the past. Some reasons to include environmental conditions would be if, say, it's an excessively hot or dry year, you may see changes to the vegetation compared to a cool or wet year. I'm going to briefly highlight that there's 3 different categories as part of the Weed Control Act, and depending on that category that the weed falls into, you may have restrictions on which control options are available. So prohibited weeds tend to be absent or very rare, so the goal is eradication of those plants. Noxious weeds, which includes leafy spurge, may be well established in some areas, while other areas of the province it's still absent. And then nuisance weeds are more ubiquitous across the province, but they have some characteristics that allow them to spread easily from one property to the next. So when you're talking about an integrated approach, there's a lot of different control options that are out there. It's important to choose the management option that are best suited to the field or pasture rather than a blanket approach across an entire operation. So I'm going to touch on really quickly a few of them, but I won't go into detail about all of them. So some of the options that are out there include tillage. Since leafy spurge is an issue typically in prairies or rangelands, tillage isn't always an option. In native rangeland, obviously the goal is to maintain those native forages, so tillage wouldn't be an option there. Hand pulling could be an option with very small patches, but it's not necessarily an option with larger patches, and it does contain that milky latex, so we would want to avoid and minimize contact, and it's important to wear gloves and wash your hands when handling the plant. Mowing likely won't kill the plant, but what it can do is prevent the seeds from setting and then reduce the energy reserves of that plant. This could be used as part of an integrated approach, but it isn't necessarily ideal with all vegetation types or terrains. Burning would be another option that can be part of an integrated approach, but similar to mowing, it isn't necessarily effective on its own and can cause resprouting. So it would likely be best used in combination with other control methods, and it really depends on what site you're at. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Joanne, and she's going to briefly talk about biological control agents that are available for leafy spurge.
All right, so hopefully you can see my screen here.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Perfect. So thank you. And as Alana said, I'm going to go over leafy spurge biocontrol. And before I get started, I just wanted to go over what exactly biocontrol is. And it's the introduction of natural predators from an invasive plant's native range to control the target plant's population. So biocontrol agents will feed on and weaken the plants, and this will gradually suppress the weed population. So biocontrol is a good option for integrated weed management that will provide widespread long-term control of the target weed. And another thing I wanted to note is that biocontrol agents are tested extensively to ensure that they only attack the target weed species. So biocontrol in Saskatchewan is coordinated by myself and my team, the Plant Health Technical Advisors from SARM. And we coordinate biocontrol agent collection, monitoring, and releases within the province. And this includes leafy spurge beetles, which is what I'm going to cover today, as well as biocontrol agents for scentless chamomile, yellow toadflax, and hound's tongue. And so if you have any questions about those other biocontrols, you can feel free to reach out after as well. So the most common and the most successful biocontrol agents for leafy spurge are the leafy spurge flea beetles. I'm going to talk about these three here, and they're the most common ones we have in the province, and they have their own preferred habitats. So the brown dot beetle will prefer hot hilltops with lighter grass cover. The black dot beetle prefers to establish on south-facing slopes, and they can tolerate some vegetation and shade cover. And the black beetle will tolerate heavier and more moist soils, and they will move into heavier vegetation and shadier areas over time as well. And the black dot beetle and the black beetle are the beetles that we see most often at our collection site at Besant Campground. So the way the leafy spurge beetles work is that most of the damage is done underground by the beetle larvae feeding on the roots. The damage the larvae cause to the roots will also serve as an entry point for different pathogens and diseases, which will further weaken the plants. The adult beetles do feed on the foliage as well, but the vast majority of the damage is done by the beetle larvae underground. So over time, the beetle damage will lead to reduced density of the leafy spurge and a decrease in flowering stems, and therefore a decrease in seed production. Over time, you'll also see just less healthy, more stunted plants and more dead plants as well. So there are some limitations when we're working with leafy spurge beetles, so I don't want to oversell them, but things to keep in mind are that the beetles are unlikely to completely eradicate leafy spurge. The leafy spurge is the beetle's food source, and so they're unlikely to eat themselves out of their food source. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the beetles do not work like herbicides. If you're looking for a short-term immediate solution, herbicide was probably going to be the better option for you, but the beetles are a great option if you're looking for a long-term continuous control option that will span over a large area. But just keep in mind that results may not be seen for several years, and the beetles may need to be added more than once. So there's a number of criteria we use to gauge how successful a beetle colony is and its impact. So this is considering the best case scenario optimal site. So the optimal site will have good beetle, an optimal site with good beetle establishment will have over 25 beetles per sweep after 1 year. The presence of beetles in a 5-pace radius from the release point after 1 year, and a noticeable reduction in flowering spurge after 2 years. During this time, you'll also see a temporary increase in non-flowering stems. So you'll see increased branching in that leafy spurge. And as well, you should see a decrease in the dry weight of leafy spurge and an increase in the dry weight of grasses and other herbaceous species. So the target with any beetle release is to reduce cover to 5%, and this can often be accomplished within 5 years. But some sites are not optimal, so sometimes we'll see good control after more than 5 years, closer to 10, and you may need to release the beetles more than once. So the pictures I have on this slide are basically as close as you can get to a textbook optimal site, keeping in mind that this was a fairly small patch of leafy spurge and they released over 6,000 beetles onto it. So that's a pretty high amount of beetles to the area of leafy spurge. But you can see over 2 years, we actually saw really good visual results. And by 2024, the leafy spurge was almost completely gone from this area. A more realistic example here, but still pretty dramatic based on the pictures, is this example from Last Mountain Lake. And so in the early to mid 2010s, the landowner originally released some beetles here. And I got involved in 2020 when the landowner reached out to me to come monitor, because as you can see, the leafy spurge was still quite healthy and tall and very dense. And when I came out, there were some beetles there, and so they had established, but in pretty low numbers. And so I recommended that he add some additional beetles to help rejuvenate the population. So he released another 5,000 beetles that summer. And then over the next 2 years, I saw this significant decrease in the density of the leafy spurge. And the surrounding spurge, so out of this picture, there is still some spurge there, but the spurge had about 15 to 20 beetles per sweep. So overall, this was nearly a 10-year process with additional beetles released to see these visual results. So if you're considering releasing leafy spurge beetles, first you should consider if you have a suitable release site. So you do need to release beetles to an undisturbed area. So there can't be any cultivation, mowing, any spring flooding, or herbicide application, because these will interfere with the beetle establishment. And your infestation should be more than 12 acres per quarter section of land. Anything smaller than this is going to be best dealt with herbicide. And the other scenario where the beetles would be a good option would be if you have leafy spurge present in areas where herbicide application is not possible. such as environmentally sensitive areas, along waterways and things like that. And the other thing I just wanted to put in here too is that the beetles will only really establish in sunny areas. So if you release them into thick trees, they probably won't establish. So if you release them in a sunny area where they can move into trees after they've established, that's always the better option. So if you're interested in collecting leafy spurge beetles for release on your land, myself and the other plant health technical advisors hold leafy spurge beetle collection days every year at Besant Campground. And these days are open to all landowners, RMs, and First Nations to come collect leafy spurge beetles for release on their property. And we're there to show you how to sweep for the beetles, provide information on having a successful release, and assist in packaging up the beetles. We also give you a release form to fill out and return so that we can come out in future years to monitor your beetle populations and see if they've established and if they're having success at your release site. So collection days take place every July, and they're tentatively scheduled for July 7th to 10th in 2025. If you want to be added to my mailing list for information on these collection days, feel free to send me an email at phndivision2@sarm.ca, and I'll add you to my mailing list. And I'll just leave you here with a map of the plant health technical advisors. Feel free to reach out to any of us for more information on biocontrols or any of the SARM sustainable CAP programs. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Joanne. So I'm going to hand it over to Trevor now, who is going to talk a little bit more about herbicide control options.
Thanks, Alana. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about the herbicide options. Just to get a little bit of perspective here, I'm not here to sell herbicides. I'm just simply here to tell you my experience, what I've observed over the last 25 plus years working in Saskatchewan on rangeland and pasture situations, working with leafy spurge. So I've broken the chemicals down on this page here by residual versus non-soil residuals. So some have like a lengthy residual time in the soil, and some do not. There's 5 there that have some residual activity in the soil. Some products have a shorter residual, some have longer. Some are up to 3 or 4 or 5 years even. Tordon 22K would have the longest residual activity of those products there. The 3 I'm just going to highlight here on this presentation is the ones in bold there. Tordon 22K, Grazon XC, and the True Range or Novius Flex. So Tordon 22K has been around for quite a few years, many years that I can recall. It's typically it's a very concentrated form of picloram, used more for spot application because of cost. It's more of access through RMs, that kind of thing, for treatment on spot areas. It's can be a little hard on the grass in the sense that it may set the grass back for a year or so after it's applied. Generally doesn't kill the grass, but a newer type of picloram product is Grazon XC, but it's got basically a watered down form of the picloram in it, plus 2,4-D. So it's a cheaper formula to apply on pasture and rangeland, and with the 2,4-D on it, it gives really good control the year it's applied, and then fairly good control in the second and maybe even the third year as well. But for sure, really good control for 1 or 2 years, and then it starts to wear off after that. The True Range is a new product, came on stream about the last 4 or 5 years. I'd say I've seen it come into use. It's I have to say it seems pretty exciting. It brings a new product that's got some pretty good residual activity, probably 2 years of decent control on leafy spurge, and probably pretty good control in the third year as well. But I guess we'll have to keep looking or watching that product. But in terms of these residual products, the True Range, from my understanding, it's priced in around $33 per acre range to apply the product or to purchase it. Grazon XC, my understanding it's in that probably mid-$60s per acre to get the product, is my understanding. And Tordon 22K price is still to be determined. There's no prices out yet for this upcoming year. The Restore 2 and Overdrive, you know, I'm not aware of these being used too much, although they are listed as options for people to use. I'd say both those products, though, they would not give real long control, like kind of season long control the year they're applied, or in the Overdrive situation, they're calling it top growth suppression. I will say the True Range, something unique about it is a granule, dispersible granule that needs to be kept in suspension. So it's a product that, if you're going to be using it, needs to have an agitator in it, or an agitation system. So probably not a good option if you're using a backpack sprayer, you know, but if you have like an ATV sprayer or something else that's got a good agitation system in it, that is a really good product in that situation. Soil residual products, 2,4-D, amine, and dicamba are options listed in our crop protection guide. 2,4-D, I guess it's got a very, very short residual activity. In the year you apply it, you probably have to look at even maybe 2 applications if you're looking to control leafy spurge through that year, with multiple applications yearly. So probably doing it for 4 or 5 years in a row. 2,4-D and dicamba, from what I understand, cost to purchase, we're probably in that $21, $22 per acre range. So next slide, please. The thing to remember when using these chemicals, they're all broadleaf type chemicals. They will remove your desirable forbs. So any legumes, desirable alfalfa plants, for example, will be removed with these chemicals. So we talked about prices already, but also important to also recognize that when you're applying these type of products, there is quite usually a significant application cost as well. Quite often dealing with topography that is very rugged or rough, and you may need a lot of person hours to go out and actually spray some of these areas. Next slide. Very important to keep competition from existing vegetation. So recognizing these will take out your broadleaf vegetation, but keep your grass very, very healthy. So doing good grazing management, any extra competition from that grass is going to help, compete against the potential leafy spurge that's there. Chemicals are only one tool in the toolbox. So keep in mind, part of this webinar today is to look at various options to give you a kind of a multi-pronged approach, some options in your toolbox for controlling spurge. Chemical is one of these options. It's not the only option. I will say a chemical, I think, is the best control option for small patches. So when a situation where you first observe it or it first arrives on your property, that's where chemical is the best option. Go in and get rid of it as soon as possible. You can't afford to wait 2 or 3 years for a biocontrol to establish and start to survive in that area. Always read and follow label recommendations prior to application. Each product has its own unique label. Important to follow directions and get the maximum benefit you can from that product, because you're paying good money for these products. Pay very good attention to your water volume. So don't short yourself in water volume. You want good application coverage. Make sure you're watching the timing as well. Are the weeds in the stage where they need to be for application? Surfactants. A lesson I've learned in using these products for leafy spurge controls, you can't skip on surfactants. If they recommend surfactant, use that one, and that's you won't get adequate control without those surfactants. And difficult to achieve 100% control with which one application of chemical. These are very challenging weeds to try and eradicate. You've got roots and seeds in the system there, extremely depth of roots, and you've got multiple years of seeds in the soil as well. We've been told in agriculture a lot of times, annual cropland, where you can apply a chemical and you'll deal with your weed problem. You can perhaps maybe suppress it, I think, with these chemicals for maybe 2 or 3 years until the residual activity wears off, and chances are it'll come back on you again. So you need to repeat monitor and repeat follow-up on these areas to get long-term control. Next slide. Just wanted to share this briefly. It's just a project I become involved in. out at the Maroon area. There's a pasture there that we've had spurge at for multiple decades, like 50 plus years. So I was brought in to help with a monitoring project. Started in about 2002 there through till 2019. And these weren't annual visits, just went back when I could get out to that area. But I've got several years there of visits to the site and my recording. I went back to the same site. It was one particular field. There's other fields too, but showing these results for one field, and I think it's the same general trend we're seeing in all the areas. But you see sheep were used initially at the very start of this project in 2002, 2003. We actually had sheep out there, and there was some control being achieved. You can see 37 stems per half meter by half meter quadrat. So that was how many stems were out there when we started this project. So an extremely dense stand of leafy spurge. Sheep did bring that density down, we're down to about 16 there in the second year. And then in around, I can't say exact year, but around 2005, 2006, maybe even late 2006, we started a spraying program out there. And you can see that continue to bring those densities down. So the message is, you need long-term control of these areas, and one spray application isn't going to treat your problem. Or grazing by sheep will not control it for a year or two. It's long-term, and you got to stay on it. You can see by the end of the 17 years, they were down to about 0.8, so less than one plant per half meter quadrat. In terms of stem height, we'd taken those stems from 13 to 18 inches down to 6 to 11 inches. So the stand had got a lot thinner, and we'd also shorten the height up of those plants as well. So their vigor is being reduced. In terms of cover in that area, in terms of vegetation cover, we saw spurge go from, in the first couple of years there, 27 to 46%. That's how much spurge was there, volume-wise. We saw that reduced down to about 3%. And then we saw good things with the grass as well. We saw grass, go from say 50% to 72%, increase to about 97 or 98% of that area. So we saw great things. Maybe next slide, please. All those monitorings were done at the end of June, mid to end of June. Just to give you a series of photos to show you what we saw out there. So obviously this project started in 2002. I didn't have a picture to show you for 2002 in my slide deck here, but I had a picture from 2008. And you can see in that picture, there is some yellow in that picture. There is some spurge still out there. Those plants, they're a lot thinner. They've been shortened up some. They're not as tall. So gradually we're working to reduce its vigor out there. Because keep in mind, there was acres and acres of leafy spurge in this pasture, right? So it wasn't something new that had been there. 2011, so 2 more years later, I went back out there at some monitoring locations. And if you look at that middle picture there, if you looked across the landscape, you'd say, okay, looks pretty clean. That would have been the second year after a chemical application. But that last picture would be a zoom in or a close up of the vegetation. And you can see it's mainly grass out there, but you've got one spurge coming back in that area. So what's happening here, we're getting towards the probably middle to end of the second year, and we're starting to see that chemical wearing off in the soil. So next slide, please. Going back in 2019, that was last year, I was out there to monitor this project. The stand was looking pretty clean. Over those years, we cleaned it up. There's, it's all pretty much all grass there. We've got one lone spurge plant there, but you can see it's not real vigorous. It's probably maybe going to be delayed flowering that year. It's got very short height as well. Next slide, please. Sometimes you wonder if you're making a difference. So I was out there and I completed that monitoring actually that same day. I drove out of the pasture and driving along the road, and this is a field I went past on the way out of the pasture. So when you look at those slides, you can see that we definitely made a difference over those 17 years. So this is what it would have looked like had we not done sheep grazing and the chemical control over those number of years. So we need the mindset that you cannot simply spray once and walk away. Large infestation will take years of follow-up management and control, but you need to keep on it. And monitoring is very important. Marking those plant locations and knowing whether you're making any progress or not. And important to go back several years after the same location to make sure you've actually got good control and potentially eradicate that area. So that's it for me. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Trevor. So now I'm going to touch base a little bit about targeted grazing. So the use of targeted grazing is using animals or livestock to defoliate, maybe trample, and reduce the seed set and energy of these plants. Targeted grazing is an option in large infestations where eradication isn't necessarily possible, and it won't be possible when using sheep. So it's best to be used in combination with other treatment options over multiple years and to eliminate the plant. In some areas, this could be an option, especially where the patch is very large, but there are some situations where targeted grazing is not an option because it can be quite intensive for weed control, which could damage other non-target plants. So one thing that's unique about targeted grazing is that you potentially have an end kind of saleable product that's feeding on that leafy spurge, which you might not have with other control options. So it's important to select the right animal for the job, and some of the things to consider are the importance of still meeting that animal's nutritional requirements. So even though a significant portion of sheep and goats diets, especially goats, can have the highest portion that can be made up of leafy spurge, it's important to consider their nutritional needs. And just because an animal can have a large component of their diet made up by spurge, it doesn't necessarily mean that those plants would be given, would be the preference for those animals given the choice. If there's too much spurge in their diet, it can result in scours, so having other forage available is still important. And considering the animal, if the animals need time to adapt, can help when you're transitioning them to a new vegetation type. An animal could also be eating the weed, but that's not necessarily meaning that it is meeting their nutritional needs for growth. So it's important to consider the age of the animals that are grazing the plant and what those individual requirements might be. Now, I don't specialize in livestock nutrition, so I won't go into too much more detail than that, but if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me after the presentation and I can put you in touch with someone who does. So sheep and goats are what we'll be talking about when we're talking about targeted grazing with leafy spurge. So this slide isn't intended to scare people away from targeted grazing. This is a really valuable tool, but I just wanted to provide a little bit of insight on the fact that there's a lot of details that can go into a targeted grazing plan or project. This is not a comprehensive list, but it touches on some of the things to consider when you're setting up one of these plans. It's valuable to think about the plant itself that you're targeting. For example, understanding when the plant's most vulnerable can help you achieve that desired level of control. And then grazing the plant prior to setting seed can help not only reduce the seeds that are being produced, but it can help reduce the amount of seeds that are being moved in the animal's wool, hair, or hooves. Understanding not only the livestock species that you're selecting, but also their dietary preference and the herd dynamics can be valuable when talking about weed control. This can help with avoiding grazing non-target species. For instance, goats could browse more on woody vegetation. And it can also link in the need for specialized or temporary fencing in some instances that could be part of your control plan. Depending on the site itself, environmental conditions may impact your grazing plan, but also the soils and stocking rates and intensity may need to be considered or adjusted to reduce disturbance or erosion. This control method can be time-consuming and costly. It just depends on if you're contracting someone else with their animals or if you're doing this targeted grazing on your own. The costs associated with the project don't necessarily end after the animals leave the site, and good biosecurity practices can help unintentionally spreading those weeds further. So learning more about other control options can also help select if targeted grazing can be an effective control option as implemented based on how those control options interact. So I just wanted to bring a little bit of attention to some of the programs that are available for producers that are looking to control invasive weeds on their properties. So the most up-to-date information for all these programs can be found online. The Invasive Plant Control Program is delivered under the Pest Biosecurity Program, which is in partnership with the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities. So you can reach out to your RM for more information. The Targeted Grazing Beneficial Management Practice is under the Resilient Agricultural Landscapes Program, which I work with the closest. And the Crown Land Pasture Association Invasive Weed Program provides a financial assistance to help pasture associations on agriculture crown land, so they can reach out to their land management specialists for more information. Finally, to just sum things up, planning ahead allows for early detection and rapid response to these weeds. This is important because it can help avoid unnecessary costs down the road, and choosing control options that are best suited to each site can help meet your vegetation management goals. So just when push comes to shove, being prepared to adapt your plans and adjust your plans can be really valuable when creating these plans. So there's 2 more upcoming webinars in this series, but there is also the upcoming 2025 Winter Crops webinar series, which is available on the Agriculture Events calendar. If you look in your handouts portion of this GoToWebinar, you can find a handout there that has more information on where to find the events calendar, as well as other agricultural resources that can be helpful when working with invasive plants. So I'm going to hand it back to Margaret, and we have some time for questions.
Thanks, Alana. So we do have a couple questions here that I'll just ask. So the first question was for Joanne. Where could someone source the biocontrol beetles from if they were interested in getting them?
So you can source them during our Leafy Spurge beetle collection days, and they happen at the Sand Campground every July. So if you want to reach out to me directly, I can make sure I involve you in letting you know when the dates are happening and the exact location as well.
Great. And then I have a question for Trevor. In those trials that you were looking at with the herbicides, what grasses were present in those pastures? And how did the native forbs respond to the chemical treatment? Did they ever recover from the herbicides?
Grasses. So they would be, you know, majority of that pasture is crested wheatgrass. There's would be some Kentucky bluegrass. There isn't a lot of native grassland in that pasture. I guess coming back to the question of forbs, I haven't been out to do the monitoring since 2019, although I've been out there to work with the weed plan with the patron group ever since that. So these areas are still being sprayed as well by the patron group, and they're doing a great job of keeping the leafy spurge in control. So if it was a one-shot application of chemical and you walked away, I could see the forbs coming back in there for sure. But in the situation where they're repeated every 2 or 3 years, probably there will be another spraying treatment done on those areas. I don't think it's fair to feel that. I don't think we'd be seeing much forbs coming in at the, you know, with that use going on. So hope that answers your question.
Great. And then another question for you, Trevor. I had someone say that they found Navius Flex is the same formulation to True Range, but it's substantially more expensive than True Range. So have you seen that in your experience?
True Range is what I'm hearing about people using these days. Navius Flex is what we had before True Range was an option. Yeah, I wonder if it's to do more with the application too. So the True Range is, I think, more something used more for pasture situations, so probably bigger, large areas. Whereas Navius Flex would be probably more of a situation where you're using for smaller areas, potentially trying to get some better control on the weeds in those particular locations. So My understanding is the same chemistry, but there might be some slight concentration differences. Sorry, I don't sell the chemical, I just work with it, so that's my perspective on it.
Thanks, Trevor. And then a question, I think this would be for Joanne or anyone. Has information reached RMs as there's funding available from local RMs for certain sprays, but not all of them? This person only has one option available and they're worried about resistance from that spray. Are RMs aware of all her chemical options available?
Yeah, so I can try to answer this. So they're probably talking about the funding through the Invasive Plant Control Program. And through that program, we have a list of approved herbicide for each weed species. So I'm not sure exactly which weed species they're thinking about, but we do share all the program information with RMs. And so your RM administrator should have all the information as well. And you can also reach out to me directly if you have any questions about what herbicides are eligible for each weed species, and go from there.
Thanks. This might be a question for Trevor. For chemical management or herbicide usage, are there any aquatic herbicides approved for application on leafy spurge in Saskatchewan?
Yeah, that's not an easy question to answer. I can tell you what I know. So we had asked another person in our office or within the Ministry of Agriculture about buffers around areas. So regarding leafy spurge near water, like Tordon 22K, which is the picloram product, has a 4-meter buffer to shallow water. So shallow water would be anything less than one meter, and a 2-meter buffer to deeper water. And then regarding from a terrestrial perspective, so on the land level, when you're applying these products, you know, at a fairly on a large area, there's a 120-meter buffer in that situation. But if herbicide applications are made by hand wands, so such case with a backpack sprayer, these buffers with Tordon 22K, and also can be the case with several of the other products for leafy spurge as well, do not apply. So, so I guess what I'm hearing is that if you're using a backpack sprayer and you can be actually very selective in where you're applying that product, those terrestrial buffers are not as much of an issue. But if you're applying a large area, such as on a field basis, those buffers need to pay very strong attention to them. It comes back to the residual activity as well, too, right? And I know if you're looking at around water areas too, I think you'd have to work with Water Security Agency probably even to get a permit to apply in those areas. Is my understanding, because it's around those areas where sometimes it's hard to treat. You'd have to get a permit probably to go in and apply, and they'd want to know what products you're using and how you're applying it. So I know people scared to go that route, but it would be the proper way to go if you're going to look at that as an option. I know other people will use the biocontrol or other options around water sources because of the challenge with chemical in close proximity to water sources.
Thanks, Trevor. Another question for Joanne. What is it about the Besant campground that makes it such a good beetle collection site? Does it have a leafy spurge population that the beetles are established on?
Yes, exactly. So they released the leafy spurge beetles at Besant campground, I believe in the very late 80s or early 90s. And so the beetles have been there along with the leafy spurge population since then. And they released multiple different species of the leafy spurge flea beetle. And so that's been our collection site basically ever since. And we are finding now, over 30 years in, that site is actually maturing and there's less spurge and less beetles every year. So we are kind of on the lookout for new collection sites throughout the province. So if anybody has any leads on a really well-established beetle colony that's on public lands, I'd love to hear about it.
Thanks, Joanne. Oh, here's one. You talked about I think this is Alana. You talked about spreading seeds via hooves and hides. When leafy spurge plants and seeds are consumed, are they still viable after they've been through the animal's digestive system, cattle or sheep?
I don't know off the top of my head the percentage would still be viable. If you want to reach out to me after the webinar, though, I can track down that information for you for sure.
And then another question here, can't remember who was talking about this specifically, but were spurge hawk moths released at May Roney as a biological control?
I don't know if Trevor and Joanne want to chime in a little on this. Spurge hawk moths aren't necessarily the most effective biocontrol when released on their own. They do defoliate the plant so they can reduce the energy reserves. Joanne has a little more experience with monitoring in that area than necessarily I do, but from what I've seen, they look quite showy and they will defoliate the above ground growth, but they're maybe not necessarily as effective as other options. Trevor, do you know if they were specifically released?
My experience is that they can be a great tool in the years that they're abundant, but they're very hit and miss from one year to the next, whether they overwinter or not. I've seen them. I've seen them around Mayron. I've seen them around the Mortlack area, which wouldn't be too far from the Sand Campground area. So they are around, but very hit and miss. It's not something that's there every year for you. So that'll be the challenge with it.
Exactly, yeah. Alana's right, they do defoliate and can be, when they're really abundant, it can look really good because they'll strip the leafy spurge right of its leaves, but it won't do the same damage to the roots that a leafy spurge beetle will.
Yeah, it's another form of biocontrol, right? But it's not, it feeds above ground versus below ground. Yeah.
Yeah, just not as effective.
Great, thanks. I don't see any other questions here, but if anyone would like to send questions afterwards, those contacts are on the screen for you as well.